Right, hello, you nine. It's Mr. Wilson here, and I'm going to be doing the voiceovers for any of your history lessons on Germany that are not given to you through live teaching, which will come into effect soon. This goes for not just my classes, but also Mr. Gillis' classes and Mr. Fisher's classes. You will all be receiving any of your history lessons voiced over, done by me. You lucky people. So today, what we're doing is we're carrying on with our study of what happens to Germany after the First World War. And I've got to stress how important this topic is for anyone who is thinking of taking history at GCSE, because this is a topic we do in quite a lot of depth when you get into the end of year 10 and the start of year 11. So, our lesson inquiry for today is: how far did Germany resist the Treaty of Versailles? And we have four keywords. We have extremist, which is a person who holds left or right wing beliefs but is as far away from the centre of the political spectrum as possible. Now, I know that might not make much sense to you right now, but I will explain it later. We have abdication, which is basically when a king or a queen gives up their throne, they give up ruling a country. We have a republic, which is a nation whose government is headed or led by a president instead of a king or a queen. So the biggest republic we could probably think of right now is the United States of America, who has President Donald Trump. They are a republic. And we have a putsch, which is a German word, and it basically means it's a violent attempt to overthrow government. It's basically like a riot or what could be known as a coup. So, as we should know from our lessons before Christmas and before New Year, Germany signed the Treaty of Versailles on the 28th of June 1919, and it was despised by many people in Germany because they thought it was too harsh and it was too punishing them too much. It restricted Germany's military, it imposed heavy reparations, and it significantly reduced the size of its empire. And most importantly, and the thing that annoyed Germans the most during this time, was the fact that it blamed them for the war and not any other country that fought in it. This made the people of Germany angry because they felt like they had been stabbed in the back by a group of people who became known as the November Criminals, and they are the ones who signed the armistice on the 11th of November 1918 that stopped the war. And you can see that from this cartoon just to the right of the text, where you see the November Criminals stood there behind the soldiers in the trenches with a knife ready to literally stab them in the back. It was the same delegates who signed the Treaty of Versailles. These people who signed and ended the war in 1918 signed the Treaty of Versailles in 1919, even though Germany was not allowed to negotiate for this treaty. Basically, Germany was forced to accept this treaty and they had no say in it. So just to remind you of what we've already talked about in lessons, this is a sort of slimmed down version of the Treaty of Versailles, which many of you should have in your history books in school. You can see number one at the top was that Germany had to accept all blame for the war. Germany's army was reduced to 100,000 men, which may sound like a lot to us, but in terms of an actual military it is very small. Germany was only allowed 6 battleships as well. Germany was not allowed to build any aeroplanes, submarines or tanks. And Germany had to pay £6.6 billion in reparations to the countries that had won the war. Now, this might sound like a lot to us, but in terms of countries, 6.6 billion in today's money isn't actually that much. But back in the 1920s, £6.6 billion was a ridiculous amount of money, to the point that Germany actually only paid off this bill in 1992. All of Germany's colonies, so the areas that it owned that was outside of Germany, for example in Africa, were given to France, Britain and any other country that was on the winning side. Germany was forbidden to unite with Austria, that means it could not make an alliance. Germany had to demilitarise the Rhineland, which, if you can't remember, is that little bit of land between France and Germany, so that France felt safe. An area called Alsace-Lorraine, a territory which is like a little area of land between France and Germany, was taken away from Germany and was given back to France, who had previously owned it. And finally, Germany lost a strip of land called the Polish Corridor, which basically split Germany in two and gave Poland, a brand new country, access to the sea. However, how did the people of Germany react to this? Because so far it does sound pretty unfair on Germany. Well, the first thing we need to know, and like I said, you don't have to write any of this down, it's just a bit of background before we actually get into some proper work. But the first thing we need to know is that Kaiser Wilhelm II, who was the King of Germany during World War II, decided to abdicate after signing the armistice. And this left Germany without a ruler, which meant they had no one in charge. It was the government that replaced the Kaiser, this thing called the Weimar government, who were the ones that signed the Treaty of Versailles. So the people that came after the King of Germany, after the Kaiser, were the ones that agreed to this Treaty of Versailles. Now, if they were the ones that agreed to this Treaty of Versailles, how would the people of Germany feel about this government? I'm going to give you a minute just to pause this video and quickly answer that question. Okay, good. So the government, hopefully you got something like these people would be very unpopular. They might be the government, but they were not liked by the people of Germany. This particular government, however, was also made up of loads of different things called political parties that are, and they were known as being on the centre or liberal parties. And we're going to look at what that actually means now, along with this term political spectrum, which I mentioned right at the start. I will warn you, this can get a little confusing, but it's really important that we understand this, like I said, for GCSE and for when you watching the news or anything. For example, when you're watching Boris Johnson or you hear your parents arguing about who should be Prime Minister or something like that, this is going to explain what they're arguing about. So, this first off, the best way to explain what the political spectrum is by looking at it as if it's just a line like this. On either side of this line, you have two different groups. You have one group called communism and one group called fascism. Now, communism is this idea that pretty much everything should be shared. And that all people that work in places like factories should share the wealth and the profits made by those businesses. Fascism, on the other hand, is this idea that everything that a person makes should go towards the state and basically used to make the state, or the country in particular, more better, to improve that country. These are directly opposite ideologies. They do not agree at all. For example, and you might have heard of some of them before. So, for example, communism was very popular during the 20th century in Russia. You might have heard of the the USSR, which was a communist country for a long, long time. Today we can think of China and North Korea. They're communist countries today. Fascism, on the other hand, that is things like the Nazis. Italy was fascist, which we're going to look at later. Spain was as well. The 20th century was full of fascist countries. Now, the problem is with this word fascist is today it gets thrown around quite a lot. For example, Donald Trump has been accused of being a fascist. And it's kind of lost its meaning. I will say there are no fascist governments or countries today, but people have accused certain people around the world of being fascist. Now, directly in the middle of that, you have something called liberalism. And this is directly in the middle of the two. They kind of want to share things, but they kind of want to make the country better as well. A little bit to the left that's not quite communism is something called socialism. And then a little bit to the right that's not quite fascism, you have something called conservatism. Now, this is the political spectrum. Now, with this, it is important to understand that every single person in the world if you have an opinion, is somewhere on this spectrum. Even if you say you do not like or care about politics, your opinion is somewhere on the spectrum. For example, and this is just a rough estimate, so you are welcome to disagree with me. This is just a general guess. Donald Trump is roughly there on the political spectrum. He is a bit past conservatism, but he is not a fascist. Boris Johnson, our current Prime Minister, is very much around conservatism. With the coronavirus pandemic, he's moved less so, he's moved close to liberalism, but traditionally Boris Johnson is around conservatism, which you might have picked up knowing that he is part of the Conservative Party. Now, I don't know if you'll have heard of him, but the leader of the opposition, Boris Johnson's opponent, is a man called Keir Starmer. And he is roughly here on the political spectrum. He is closer towards socialism. Now, Keir Starmer is the leader of the Labour Party, and they are Boris Johnson's opponents. And just in case, so we've got another one. Joe Biden, who was Donald Trump's opponent, is there. He is just past liberalism towards the slightly what we call right wing. So you've got left wing there with communism, socialism, and Keir Starmer, and you've got right wing with Joe Biden, and then moving up to Boris Johnson, and then moving up further to Donald Trump. If you want the extremes of this, on the left you would have people like Joseph Stalin, Vladimir Lenin, and then on the right you would have Adolf Hitler and a bloke called Benito Mussolini from Italy. As you can see there. Now, like I said, every single person is on this political spectrum. All your teachers are somewhere on it, even though we do take great efforts to keep our opinions private because we don't want to influence your opinion in any way. And you are on this somewhere, based on what you believe should happen to countries and what should happen in the world. Each political party is on this spectrum as well, and like I said, in this country we have Labour and the Conservatives, and in Germany during the 1920s you had a group called the Communists, which I've already mentioned, and you had a group called the Nazis, the National Socialists, which were fascists on the right. So, what I'd like to do now is, based on what I've just said, I would like to summarise what is this political spectrum in no more than 20 words. Pause the video if you need the time, and go back and rewatch it if you're struggling. But what is this political spectrum? So, in Germany during the 1920s, this political spectrum still exists. It has existed for hundreds of years now, and it looks a little bit more complicated. Now, I'm not going to spend too much time on this table because it is actually a table for GCSE, and we spend a lot of time on it in Year 11. But just looking at it, we can see loads of different parties in Germany. For example, in Germany, political parties tend to have initials as their names to make it look shorter. For example, where it says the NSDAP on the very right wing, that is actually the Nazi Party with Adolf Hitler. And then if you look at the other extremists, the KPD, they are the Communist Party in Germany. And the middle parties would be, for example, the SPD, the DDP, the ZP, and the DVP. Now, as a result of the Treaty of Versailles, two extremist groups on either side of the political spectrum, both left-wing and right-wing, saw an opportunity to rebel against this German government. And what we're going to look at now is these two different rebellions. And the first one we're going to look at is a left-wing rebellion known as the Spartacist Uprising. So what I would like to do is just write the subheading from it, the Spartacist Uprising, which is a left-wing. And then as we go through it, what I would like to do is summarise what was this Spartacist Uprising and what happened in Germany in 1919. So first of all, the Spartacist Uprising began with two people. began with a woman called Rosa Luxemburg and a man called Karl Liebknecht, and they led 100,000 workers in an uprising in this Weimar government, against this Weimar government, I should say, this German government. What they did, they basically asked people to come out on strike from the factories, arm themselves, and head to Berlin, where they started to riot. They had the backing of the communists in Russia, so they felt pretty confident they had one of the biggest countries in the world supporting them, wanting to get rid of this government in Germany. A man called Ebert, not Herbert, it's Chancellor Ebert, he organised loads of World War I soldiers who had just come home from the war. And what he did, he got these soldiers and he unleashed them on these rioters. And by that I basically mean is he sent them in to stop the riots and even kill some of them. Rosa Luxemburg, which is the woman in the picture you can see there, was one of those people killed, and she was killed by being hit in the back of the head with the butt of a rifle, and then her body was dumped in a nearby canal. So it was not a peaceful death in any way. So what I'd like you to do, based on what I've just told you, is quickly under your subheading summarise what was the Spartacist uprising. And if you're struggling, it is a communist uprising in Germany that failed because World War I soldiers were used to stop it. After you've done that, what I'd like to do is write another subheading, the Kapp Putsch in 1920. And we can see here, if you're struggling to spell it, it's Kapputsch, the Kapp Putsch. Now in 1920, Ebert wanted to get rid of the Freikorps, these World War I soldiers that had been used to put down the Spartacist uprising. 5,000 of these soldiers weren't having it. They were absolutely really angry. And what they decided to do is they decided to march into Berlin with all their weapons, and they kicked out the government that was there. So this government used these people, this government hired these people to do a job, and then decided to get rid of them, and then these soldiers were not happy about it, so they kicked the government out. These Freikorps soldiers, they wanted to replace this government with a man called Wolfgang Kapp, which is where this gets its name from. The Kapp Putsch is named because of a man called Wolfgang Kapp, and he wanted them to be their new leader until they could get the Kaiser, which if you remember is the King of Germany, to return. And the Weimar government, to stop this, they asked all the workers in Germany in factories and newspaper offices and things like that, they asked them all to go on strike. Meaning the Freikorps and the Kapp Putsch couldn't run Berlin properly, and people ended up with no electricity, no water, no food, and people getting very angry at these Freikorps soldiers. So, what I'd like to do is make sure you have two summaries of each of these different things. So we've got the Spartacist uprising, which is a left-wing uprising, and we have the Kapp Putsch, which is a right-wing uprising. So make sure you have two summaries of each of these things. And if you're struggling, I'll put some key points in a table on the slide to help you. And if you need the time, please pause the video here to make sure you have those two summaries of these key events. So, what we're going to do today is we're going to have a go at a skill that we've kind of been practicing in lessons before Christmas. It is an exceptionally important skill because it is something that we're going to be using at GCSE, and it is our historian proves that what they're arguing is right. We are going to look at something called source utility or source analysis. And what I'd like to do now is write the subheading source utility / source analysis and underline it neatly for me. While you're doing that, I just want to explain that we're going to use our own knowledge of these two things, the Spartacist uprising and the Kapp Putsch, to analyse a poster made during this time. And in particular, it is a Spartacist poster, so you're going to need your first summary in mind when we have a look at this. So the first thing we do when we're analysing a source in history is we have to look at its content. And by content I basically mean what is in the source. So if you're having a look at this source, you can see it is a poster, and first thing that hits me is that there is a big green monster with loads of different heads. Just behind the big green monster, staring at it, there is a man holding a sword ready to kill the monster. And in the bottom I've noticed it says a little thing, if you can't see it, it says KPD. If anyone can remember what that is the Communist Party in Germany. And Versailles Spartacus is German. It basically means what will the Spartacists do? So what can we see in this poster? What I'd like to do is under your subheading is first answer that question. If you need the time, please pause the video here. Now once we've got what's in this poster, what we now need to do, and this is the really hard bit, is we need to say why is this useful. So first, before we do that, can anyone think of what word we would use to describe this poster? It's a special word that's used when you're trying to convince someone to do something by basically either making them feel good or telling them little fibs. Shout out the answer now. Okay, if you shouted out the word propaganda, which we have used a lot in lessons, then you are right in the sense that this is a piece of propaganda. It is a propaganda poster. Now, how is it useful? Well, basically, it's telling us something about the Spartacist uprising. It's telling us what the Spartacists wanted us to think about their uprising. For example, that man there with the sword is a Spartacist, and that monster there with all the different heads is meant to be Germany, or the Germany they're trying to get rid of. For example, it's trying to get rid of things like landowners, the business, the government, the army. It's the Spartacists killing that German monster. So it's useful because it shows us what the Spartacists wanted us to think about their uprising. Once we have assessed the content, we have to move on to something else, and we call this the provenance. Now, the provenance of a source is basically its nature, origin and purpose. And by that I mean, what is the source, when was it made, why was it made, and then how does this make it useful? Now for this, it's not actually looking at the cartoon or the poster or the primary source itself. It's looking at the little bit of writing that is either at the top or the bottom of it, normally in a box. For example, for us, this source, the provenance, is in a yellow box just above the poster. So just above the poster, it reads Source D, a Spartacist poster from the 1920s. The Spartacist champion of the people slays the three-headed monster, the army, big business and landowners, considered by the extreme left wing to be opposing the people. So, for our questions, what we're going to do, and you're going to answer these for me, is what is the source? When was it made? Why was it made? And how does this make it useful? Please pause the video now and have a go at answering these questions. So, if you have answered these questions, your answer should look something like this. For example, what is the source? Your answer should be, it is just a poster or a propaganda poster. When was it made? It was made during the Spartacist uprising in the it was made after the Spartacist uprising in the 1920s. Because if you remember, the Spartacist uprising came and happened in 1919. Why was it made? Well, it's a piece of propaganda, so it's made to convince someone of doing something, or convince someone that something that's happened was a good thing. And how does all this make it useful? Well, it tells us what the Spartacists wanted us to think. It tells us when it was made, so this is telling us what they want. It tells us what they wanted us to think of an event that has already happened. And it was made to change our minds. So the last thing I'm going to ask you to do today is, based on those questions we've just answered together, I would like you to put them into a paragraph to tell me how useful is this poster to a historian wanting to research the Spartacist uprising. So it's one paragraph I'm asking you to type up, and what I'd ask you to do, is try your best with it. I have not given you sentence starters on purpose, because first off, before we can help you improve this, we need to see what you can do on your own to start with. So it's one paragraph. How useful is source D for a historian wanting to research the Spartacist uprising? Use the questions we've just gone through to help you, and rewind and go back on this video if you need to. Once you have typed up your answer, please make sure it is on your Word document or PowerPoint or on your paper with the rest of your answers. And then can you please email this to your normal history teacher, whether it be me, Mr. Fisher, or Mr. Gillis, so we can have a look at your answers, provide any feedback, and catch any misconceptions. Next lesson, we'll be carrying on with looking at Germany, and we'll be looking at something called the Ruhr crisis and hyperinflation, which is basically where things get even worse for Germany during this time. Okay, thank you very much, Year 9.